Well, good morning, everyone. I am happy to be joining you here from Treaty 6 territory in the traditional lands of the Métis. My name is Samantha Becotte, and I'm the president of the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. I want to thank everyone for joining us here this morning, and especially I want to add an extra thanks to some special guests that I have joining me. So Karen Brown, who's the president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, Clint Johnston, the president from British Columbia Teachers Federation, and Connie Keating, who is the past president of New Brunswick Teachers Association, as well as a current vice president for the Canadian Teachers Federation. It's nice to have familiar faces here joining me today to add their voices to our conversation. So thank you for coming. Like I just said, I'm happy to have these three leaders here to talk about their experiences in their provincial organizations around class size and complexity and how they've successfully negotiated these articles into their provincial agreement, as well as the positive impacts that the articles have had on the experiences of students and teachers in their respective provinces. Before we get to the other provinces, though, I just want to remind people of where we are within Saskatchewan education, how we got to this point. So in 2013, Saskatchewan was first in the country for per student funding. But over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party government has made deliberate decisions to underfund education. Along with the $54 million that they cut from the education budget in 2017, this government has kept budget increases below enrollment growth and inflation rate increases. This has moved Saskatchewan from first in the country to eighth in the country for per student funding, with over $400 million needed to restore schools to the level of supports that they had a decade ago. The impacts of underfunding, along with record enrollment growth in our schools, has resulted in over 15,000 more students enrolled since 2015, and yet over the same period of time, we have only 10 additional teachers. Not only is enrollment increasing at record rates, we also have more students who require additional supports and more students with English as an additional language in our schools, and yet the number of professional supports in schools continues to decline. The STF has brought class size and classroom complexity forward through the last two rounds of negotiations, and in both rounds, our government has pushed the issues aside to a committee. Following advocacy from the Teachers Federation and also Saskatchewan School Boards Association for predictable and sustainable funding, we heard promises for renewed investment that never came. After our massive rally in April, Premier Scott Moe said, "You have been heard." And yet their actions tell a different story. And at the beginning of the school year, I was very hopeful that a new education minister would bring a much needed reset to the strained relationship between teachers and government and bring a renewed commitment to improving our struggling education system. Even last week, teachers returned to the negotiations table, and we returned in good faith with the hope that an agreement could be reached. Unfortunately, we continue to get more of the same from this government. More misinformation aimed at misleading the public, more empty promises, more bad faith negotiations, and more attempts to undermine the bargaining process. The recent MOU that was intended to address classroom complexity that the government proposed outside of the bargaining process not only can be terminated at any point, but has no dispute resolution if government doesn't uphold the agreement, which is why we have argued it must be in the collective negotiations process. Not only do teachers have a right to negotiate around their working conditions, and these working conditions are directly tied to our students' learning conditions and classroom complexity, but including a clause in the provincial collective agreement would ensure government and school boards can be held accountable for their commitments. If the Minister of Education and the Saskatchewan School Boards Association are willing to make agreements in an MOU around classroom complexity, there is absolutely no reason that I can see that it can't be part of a bargaining process, unless this government just has no intentions of upholding the agreements that they're making with teachers. Even the Saskatchewan School Boards Association has advocated for this, for predictable and sustainable funding for education. An article in the provincial collective agreement would be a positive step forward to providing predictability for school boards and improving students' and teachers' learning conditions. The challenges that we're experiencing have been created over a decade, and it's unlikely to expect that they'll be solved within 1 year, let alone a 4-year agreement. But government cannot continue to ignore these issues, and they must start making meaningful long-term commitments where they, along with school boards, can be held accountable. So I'm going to now pass it over to ETFO President Karen Brown to share about what items have been negotiated in their collective agreement.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning. I'm Karen Brown, and I'm President of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, a union that represents 83,000 teachers and education workers in Ontario. Like the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, ETFO sees bargaining as an opportunity to address important issues in education that affect teachers' working conditions and students' learning conditions. ETFO's most recent round of provincial bargaining ended in December. There was a lot of foot dragging and reluctance from the provincial government, but with the pressure of a strong strike mandate from our members and then taking the steps to file for conciliation, we were able to address many of our key bargaining priorities. These priorities included increasing special education supports, recognizing the complex needs of students in our classrooms, and dealing with violence, the issue of violence in our schools. We know that students come to school with many different needs. In order to provide them with the best education possible, the government must step up to adequately fund and support schools and educators that make public education work. In our most recent round of provincial bargaining, ETFO was able to negotiate funding to create over 830 additional permanent specialist teaching positions to directly support kindergarten to grade 8 students. This includes providing intensive support in the areas of special education, student behavior, self-regulation, social emotional needs, and early literacy. We also have an agreement to work with the government and school boards to identify best practices in the areas of decision-making, communication, and supports for the integration of students with complex needs into classrooms. Classroom complexity is a new reality for all teachers, regardless of province. When educators are required to support so many complex needs in the classroom that they become stretched beyond capacity, every student's learning experience is impacted, regardless of these needs. ETFO has started to address the workload created by complex needs in the classroom by negotiating language that requires school boards to consider the workload to individual education plans when establishing class lists in the public elementary schools. The IEP revision process that falls onto the shoulders of teachers has also been streamlined. With respect to violence in schools, a survey of ETFO members conducted in May 2023 showed that violence in schools is pervasive. 42% of respondents reported having been injured as a result of violence in the last year. This is unacceptable and must be addressed by governments everywhere. So, ETFO went to its last round of bargaining, determined to get the government to acknowledge that violence in schools is a serious concern, and that this undermines the learning experience in our schools and is a consequence of underfunding, understaffing, and unmet student needs. In addition to the specialist teaching positions we negotiated that will be focused on direct student support for behavior, ETFO negotiated an innovative, safe teaching and learning environment language. This is a written commitment from the government that it will work with ETFO as an equal partner to revise the Ministry of Education policy that establishes codes of conduct for Ontario school boards and schools. Schools need to be inclusive, respectful, and safe places to learn. Educators and students are experiencing issues in schools that disrupt learning and safety and would have been unheard of 10 years ago. So a revision of these codes of conduct is long overdue. They require changes from the perspective of classroom teachers, particularly around the issues of behavior, consequences, and adequately addressing violence in schools. This is the first time an education union in Ontario has negotiated this type of commitment from the government, and it has potential to make real changes in the day-to-day lives in schools. Like our colleagues in Saskatchewan, Ontario elementary teachers, educators know what it's like to work with more students with higher needs without the staffing and resources needed to meet those needs. ETFO is here today to support Saskatchewan teachers, to express our solidarity with their priorities, and to confirm that positive changes for students, teachers, and schools can happen at the bargaining table when the parties work together to effect positive change. During our last round of bargaining, ETFO pushed to get additional staffing and resources for our members. And we pushed further to ensure the policies designed to make schools safe places to teach and learn actually do what they're supposed to do. If this can happen in Ontario, then it can certainly happen in Saskatchewan. Solidarity. I'll turn it over to, I believe it's Clint.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, my name is Clint Johnston. As you've already been told, I'm the president of the BC Teachers Federation. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge where I am, which is on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. These three nations have stewarded these stolen lands from time immemorial. I get reminded of that every time I look out my office window, see the land and the water and the urban environment we've created around it. And reminded of our obligations to continue to work with those groups towards reconciliation. So now I'd like to speak directly in support of our colleagues, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, and share some of our experiences from British Columbia. We know in British Columbia that our educators' working conditions are our students' learning conditions. That makes bargaining for public education a bit unique. There aren't many professions where the labor force is advocating for both the workers and for children. And it may seem complicated to negotiate language for things like class complexity, but that's exactly what we do, because it's important. When we aren't able to negotiate class size limits, like we have in places in BC, and caseload ratios for specialist teachers like school counselors, or guaranteed support levels for children with diagnosed learning challenges, we are better able to do our jobs. Teachers care greatly about our students, and we want nothing more than to provide the support and encouragement they need to thrive and grow. There's nothing better than watching a student you've worked with overcome a challenge after they've struggled, or to discover joy in a new subject, or find their footing in an area that they didn't think they could succeed in. We have seen how good workload language that provides supports for teachers and students can improve success for students while helping to create working conditions that retain the workforce. But it's just not possible to connect with each student in that way when teachers are not adequately supported themselves. It's simple. When classes are too big or there aren't enough staff to help students with diverse needs, our most vulnerable students are often the first to lose the programs and services they depend on. But when teachers have manageable workloads, our students benefit. It means we have time to connect with each student, meet them at their level, and ensure they get the education we all want for them. Simply put, workload language like class size, composition, and specialist service ratios drive resources and supports into the system when it is properly implemented and supported. Putting workload language into a collective agreement also protects teachers and students from poorly thought out government policy changes and damaging cuts. We learned that lesson in BC when the government unconstitutionally stripped BC's collective agreement of class size and composition language. Classes got bigger, teachers were laid off, and students paid the price. Thankfully, we won that language back in the Supreme Court of Canada. It was a long road to get there, but the decision was swift and decisive. It was easy for Canada's top court to recognize the authority of collective agreements. Had we not had that language in the collective agreements, we would not have had that success. Class size and composition language is only a start, of course. We continue to fight for a stronger public education system of all members and students. Bargaining's on the horizon for us too, and we'll be fighting for better working conditions at the table, including prep time so teachers can plan their lessons, and more support for students with complex needs, including language like our colleagues in Saskatchewan are pursuing about class sizes and class complexities. And the ongoing teacher shortage, which I know is felt across Canada, is wearing all school staff thin and may make some language appear like it's not working. But as I said, when it is put in place and supported properly, we in BC have seen the positive impact that language specifically about class sizes, class complexity, and other issues relating to workload can have. I want to thank Samantha Becotte and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation for inviting me to speak with you today. With that, I'll pass it to Connie Keating of the New Brunswick Teachers Federation. Solidarity.
Good morning, everyone. As previously noted, I'm Connie Keating, past president of the New Brunswick Teachers Association, current vice president of the Canadian Teachers Federation, and I also am back in the classroom and teach at Becotte Regional School here in New Brunswick. So we've had the opportunity to have both class size and prep time implemented into our collective agreement. And first off, we'll address class size. One contributing factor to assuring positive learning environments in New Brunswick is that successive governments have valued class limits to address classroom complexity. Maximum class size limits create a minimum standard to meet students' needs. Given the unprecedented population growth here in New Brunswick in both rural and urban communities, this has assured predictability for students, parents, and teachers alike. There is recognition here in New Brunswick that class size matters and makes a difference. Recent government report actually recommends further class size reductions at the kindergarten to grade 5 level, and that a number of specialists resource and guidance that those ratios be increased. In reality, teachers should not have to bargain for children's rights to a positive learning environment. They are being educated to become contributing members of society. Investing in resources that ensure a positive learning environment where quality education can occur should be every government's priority. Having the minimum standard embedded in a collective agreement assures that it remains in place when there are changes in government. It prevents that pendulum from swinging back and forth between government to government. It assists in maintaining some stability to the system. It assures equity across our school boards. And here in New Brunswick, all our school districts, all our boards have class size limits. In addition, having it embedded in the collective agreement forces the hand of the employer to properly resource children's needs. There is still a significant amount of work to do to fully address classroom complexity in New Brunswick, but class size is a key component. As previously mentioned, it allows for opportunity to build relationships and connections with students, which is well documented by several educational and psychological experts. It is the starting point to a student's success. Further, it ensures quality education. By setting maximum class sizes, educators can maintain an environment conducive to effective teaching and learning. Smaller class sizes often leads to a better student-teacher ratio, enabling teachers to provide individualized attention and support. And I can speak personally to this one. During COVID in 2021, here in New Brunswick, we had a class size cap of 15 students at this point. Our classes were divided in half, and 15 students per day did attend my high school classes. Never before in my nearly 30 years of teaching have I known my students so well, built really strong relationships, knew where they were in their skills. Day to day, our interactions were very successful, And, moving forward in testing assessments following COVID, the gaps in student learning with the students who had been in classrooms where class size had been reduced, the gaps were considerably lower. And this will go down for me as a period in my teaching career where I experienced the most success. Teacher workload and management is key when we have class size caps. Larger class size significantly increase the workload and the stress level of teachers. By establishing those class limits and collective agreements, teachers can manage their workload more effectively, leading to improved job satisfaction. And what is a key interest today is retention of teachers. Student safety and well-being. Overcrowded classrooms can compromise student safety and their well-being. Class size limits help ensure that classrooms are not overcrowded, reducing the risk of accidents and enabling teachers to monitor and support students more effectively. I think in particular of the high school science labs and our industrial arts programs, where class size significantly and safety is key. Parent and community have expectations. They expect reasonable class sizes to be maintained in schools. Including class size limits and collective agreements helps meet these expectations and fosters trust and confidence in the education system. Legal protection is key, where collective agreements provide legal protection for both teachers and students. By stipulating class size limits in these agreements, educators have a mechanism to address violations and ensure that adequate resources are allocated to maintain appropriate class size. Overall, including class size limits and collective agreements helps promote the quality, the safety, and effectiveness of education by providing clear guidelines and protections for teachers and students alike. I will also take a moment to just address preparation time being embedded within our collective agreement. It is key for many of the same reasons that I've noted about why class size matters, but having prep time embedded in collective agreement assures that teachers have time daily to create lesson plans that meet the ever increasing and complex needs of their students. This is the time when teachers ensure that assessments are done, that parents are contacted, that they have the opportunity to collaborate with their colleagues, all for the end goal of ensuring quality education. And so for all of these reasons, although I've noted things are not perfect here in New Brunswick, however, having prep time and class size limits embedded within our collective agreement certainly addresses a lot of classroom complexity. And so at this point, I certainly want to wish Saskatchewan teachers solidarity. We are certainly standing with you here from New Brunswick. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, Clint, and Connie for joining us today and sharing your experiences and your solidarity with Saskatchewan teachers through the challenging negotiations process that we find ourselves in. I just want to highlight a couple of things that I had jotted down, although I could probably repeat everything that was said because it was exceptional. I'm so grateful to have the three of you here with us. But specifically, one thing Karen noted was addressing classroom complexity and supporting student needs would help minimize instances of violence and aggression in our classrooms. This would result in safer learning environments for students and working environments for teachers, which is something that we should all be striving for. The increase in violence and aggression in our schools across Saskatchewan has been a great cause for concern and something that is part of our conversation at the bargaining table as well. From BCTF, from Clint, The issue around teacher recruitment and retention, and I know we heard it echoed through the other comments as well, but this is a huge issue in Saskatchewan, specifically in our rural and remote areas and northern areas. We have issues with recruitment and retention, but it is not isolated to those areas. We have shortages of contract teachers. We also have shortages of substitute teachers. And so not just addressing salary and benefits needs to be part of the conversation, but getting down to the root cause of why teachers are leaving the profession comes down to classroom complexity and our working conditions. So addressing classroom complexity can help ensure that teachers are supported and can feel successful in their work, and that would lead to improved retention. And finally, Connie, one piece that I really appreciated from you is that these articles in the collective agreement should be viewed as a baseline or a minimum standard. So even if there were ratios for students to teachers or ratios for students to professional supports, those should be viewed as a baseline, not a standard that we need to get as close to as possible. We want to make sure that all students are successful and all students get the support that they need across our province. And in Saskatchewan, the different areas are diverse. And so we want to make sure that they can be locally responsive, but that there is a minimum standard in place to ensure a baseline level of supports. So again, we have so much in common across all of the provinces, and I'm hopeful that by continuing to work together, we can ensure that students in all areas of the country have access to high quality public education. And appreciate you joining us here today and shining a light on the fact that items on classroom complexity can be included in a provincially negotiated agreement. This isn't revolutionary. We are not reinventing the wheel here with the proposals that we brought forward for our negotiations process. Other provinces have negotiated items. And as it was noted as well, they are not perfect solutions, but they're a step forward to improvements that benefit students and teachers in schools across their respective provinces. The collective agreement is the best place for these commitments to be made to ensure that government and school boards are held to account. All students have needs. This isn't just about specific students who require additional support. Every child has a right to a high quality education, and a commitment in the provincial collective agreement wouldn't only benefit teachers, it also benefits school boards and division administration who have been challenged with difficult decisions due to constrained budgets. But most importantly, it would be for the benefit of all of our students across our province and across the country here in Canada. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us here. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer questions if you raise your hand. Alec.
Hey there. I suppose if any of the participants from other provinces are able to maybe chime in on this, I'd just be curious to hear what other former presidents of teachers' federations think about the current track taken by the Saskatchewan government in negotiations, because it's been a fairly bellicose round of interactions from the province, I'd say, and I'd be interested to hear how that compares with your own experience in bargaining on these specific matters. I'm not sure who wants to go first, so I'm just going to say, Karen, if you're game.
I think Clint had his hand up first. I'll let Clint go first and I'll jump in after. Go ahead, Clint.
Aren't we a bunch of teachers? Thank you, Karen. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. So the best I understand it, we've of course been following the situation in Saskatchewan and know the broad strokes of it. I think my takeaway is something we've experienced here with some previous governments in our bargaining rounds, which is the real kind of cognitive dissonance, the oddity of hearing a government talk about its commitment to children and students and education while also taking such an aggressive position and such kind of unprecedented moves. Like statements like "we cannot bargain something" in the public is very detrimental to any kind of bargaining process. I don't think there's any president here or any president who served in any teacher union who thinks that negotiations are easy. particularly when they're difficult, complex subjects, and they require a significant amount of funding. But I think it's that approach where you're talking about how much you value the system and the students, while also treating the people who, frankly, form the majority of that system with such disregard, and just straight out saying that things can't be done before you're even sitting at the table. I think that, to me, clearly shows someone who's actually not interested in those and is trying to find ways away from the table to avoid having to discuss, which we all acknowledge can be tough subjects, but subjects that need to be discussed.
And just adding to that, from my experience in Ontario, when a government is reluctant to bargain issues that impact students, and when we were talking about the welfare of students, we see that the community begins to rally. The parents begin to listen a little carefully to the situation, and they sort of say, well, what's wrong with investing in the system? What's wrong with smaller class sizes? My child, my grandchild, my nephew, my niece, someone I know, their children are going to benefit if I don't have children within the system. And so they start asking the difficult questions. And what we see is that a lot of support does end up with our members, and there becomes a lot of pressure where the government has to reevaluate their political will. They do have the funding, they have the ability to do it, and now it's about a political will, and are they committed to the system? And from our experience, these, as Samantha mentioned, these issues are able to be bargained. It comes down to, do they really have a commitment in strengthening public education? And that's where the bottom line is. The things that they're asking are only going to strengthen public education, and for those who are trying to deliver it, it's a win-win for everyone. So they need to really be focused and get back to the table. And it took us a long time, but they eventually did, and we were able to come to a place where this contract is good for our members, and it's good for students, and it's good for families.
I'll jump in. Basically, both my colleagues have, said for the most part exactly what we would have to say here from New Brunswick. I will point out negotiation. We've just come through a round of negotiations, and they're difficult. And oftentimes, government says, certainly as has been noted, that they value education, they value, the next generation, yet we get to the table and they're not necessarily showing that in our discussions. I will also note that we've actually, in New Brunswick, never been successful at the bargaining table in establishing class size limits. Those limits have come outside of bargaining. We have a clause in our collective agreement that notes that when announcements are made about things such as class size, that they immediately become embedded in the collective agreement. So a number of years ago, a former premier, having heard a lot of concern from both teachers and I would say parents, school boards, etc., made an announcement to reduce class size. Moving forward, as I previously noted, that a recent report here in New Brunswick notes that there's a recommendation that class size reductions should occur again at the K-5 level. These discussions are ongoing, and we hope to actually reduce class size further at that level, based on research. The process of bargaining is never easy, but as again, my colleagues have noted, if governments truly value quality education, it needs to be every government's priority that it does indeed get embedded in the collective agreements.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then Samantha, I have one just for you. You had mentioned that following this February break, there was going to be an escalation. And I know that it's 48 hours of notice that you have to offer. But given that we've seen rotating strikes, given that we've seen one-day withdrawals of lunchroom supervisions, can we take a escalation to mean longer-term mass strikes across the province affecting all STF members, or what can we expect? What can we anticipate, I suppose, going forward?
Thanks for that question. As you noted, there would be the 48-hour requirement to provide any announcement. And when we have strikes, we know that they're disruptive. And so ultimately, as these continue to escalate, as government continues to refuse to come back to the table with a renewed mandate, that escalation would likely mean more disruption. We have any option on the table, and we're considering all of the options available to us. But ultimately, the goal is to get back to the table where we can negotiate an agreement, not just on salary and benefits, which is what government wants to reduce it to, but also around protections around our working conditions with classroom complexity articles.
And I suppose the last one for me, I see other people have their hands up, but Samantha, do you think that the sort of limited approach that you've taken has been effective? Because again, when we're looking at support for the STF right now, it seems to be quite high. So I suppose if one might think that wanes over time, why not essentially strike when the iron's hot and do something like this now? Why not do larger scale job action when you have public support going in your favor, where if it is going to be disruptive to people's lives, that there might be a bit more leniency or a bit more of a relaxed feeling from the public on that?
Well, I would just reiterate one thing that my colleague Connie, I think, had said in her comments was around when we're having these conversations, parents become more aware of the issues. And so while the actions are disruptive, I think that they're seeing through those actions and recognizing that the conditions that students are learning in and day out is more disruptive to their learning than any of the actions that we have taken so far. And so I think at the core of what we have put forward, parents have our backs. And I even saw a poll as recently as this morning where 2/3 of the respondents supported teachers. And that included people with students in schools as well as individuals who don't have students in schools. And so we'll continue to look at what public support looks like, but ultimately we are committed to ensuring that students across our province have the supports that they need so that they can be successful in their K-12 education here in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, I think that's all for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Alec. Keenan?
Hi, Samantha. I'm just wondering, with having your colleagues here joining us from across the country, in your conversations with them, what has been maybe one or two of your biggest sort of takeaways that you've learned in your conversations with them?
Exactly as I have noted, is that these things can be bargained. There's ways to put agreements in or commitments into a collective agreement where government can be held accountable, and that is in the collective agreement process. And so that's one thing that I've learned, but also from the experience, maybe going back through BCTF's experience and having that enshrined in the agreement and being able to then have a dispute process if government doesn't uphold that commitment with teachers and with students. That's kind of the core of what we're looking at, is that our collective agreement can be grieved. There's a dispute process that goes along with it. And it is binding. We need to see those agreements upheld. Whereas an MOU that is outside of the bargaining process, and even it's written in the MOU that government had proposed for us recently, they can cancel it with 12 months notice. And so we need to have long-term commitments. And I guess the other piece I would take from them, from all of their experiences, is that these aren't quick solutions. These are complex problems. That's why it's called classroom complexity. It's a big issue. It's hard to define sometimes, and it's not a specific maybe checklist of solutions that can be agreed upon, and then everything is done. Whatever is proposed in the agreement this year, or whatever comes through the agreement this year, is not going to be the end of this. This is going to be an ongoing conversation that needs to continue to happen. And again, that is why it should be in the collective agreement process, where there's a natural renewal cycle that happens. And if a different course needs to be taken, that can be negotiated in a future agreement too.
Are you feeling pressure to escalate job action sooner rather than later to get some of those things in the agreement?
Teachers have been ready to take action since the beginning of September, or the beginning of our expiration of the agreement. I've been hearing from teachers across the province of saying, why aren't we taking action now? They want the supports in schools for their kids now. Like I said, this government has pushed this issue off for the last 2 rounds, essentially 7 years, that we could have started seeing progress towards improved learning conditions and improved working conditions for teachers. And they're saying we can't do it anymore. And so I wouldn't say it's as much pressure. I know teachers definitely want to see improvements and they want them sooner rather than later. As a parent, I want improvements for our students and my children and all children across Saskatchewan as soon as possible. And so we're ready to get to the table. We're ready to negotiate an agreement. And from what I have heard from teachers, they're ready to do whatever that takes, or whatever it takes to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Aishwarya?
I guess my question's for Clint. You negotiated class complexity in BC. Has that worked out the way you wanted it to, or were there any unforeseen negative impacts for teachers?
That's a great question. Thank you. And just for some context, ours was negotiated a fair while ago, most of it when they were still local. So it differs from district to district around the province. And that's interesting, both in seeing what can be successful and in seeing the different impacts it has on teachers and students. I would say that overall, the success is good when the language is properly implemented and supported. And that might sound a bit like dodging the real question, but it isn't, because like all contract language, the important part of it is you bargain it. It's complex. I mean, I think Samantha just said very well, it's called complexity for a reason. But once that language is in there, it really is about the employer's commitment to fulfilling that properly, to making sure the resources in place and the individuals that are required by that collective agreement. So if you're asking directly, we've had mixed success. We've had places where the supports are not in place, but we don't see that as any issue with language that we've negotiated. We see that as an issue with it not being implemented properly and resourced properly. Once you have language in place and it's resourced and the people are there and the resources are there, we inevitably see a better working environment for our members and a better learning environment for students. So when it's done properly, it's very successful. When it's done poorly, like many things, it's less successful.
Thank you, Clint. And Samantha, do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a specific language that you're looking at, or have you explored other ways to include it locally rather than doing it at a provincial level?
And actually a similar question is in the chat, so I'll address both of them at the same time in the chat. There was, what do you want to see specifically in a contract when looking at class complexity? So we have put forward a very comprehensive proposal as our opening item or discussion around classroom complexity. That included ratios for just about every professional support in schools. So ratios for classroom teachers to number of students, ratios with English as additional language supports, mental health supports, educational psychologists, EAs. So that was our opening proposal. And again, tying back to a point that Connie had made, is that those should be seen as a baseline. They're not the ideal situation necessarily, but beyond those numbers, things get difficult to manage and difficult to meet the needs of individual students. So the intention of that was to set a baseline, a minimum standard that all students should be able to expect to see when they move throughout our province. As people often move in different areas of the province, they should be able to know that if they're successful in North Battleford, they can be successful in Swift Current or Kamsack, right? They should be able to travel and go to different communities and get the same level of supports, or at least that minimum level. The difficulty about having it addressed locally is that local school boards don't have the ability to raise revenue anymore. All of that comes from the provincial government. And so we need an agreement at the provincial level that ensures funding is going to be provided to local school boards. But we've also had the conversation that provides more flexibility away from those ratios, just to commit to increased funding, and then a mechanism where local school boards can make the decision in consultation with teachers to ensure that the supports are getting directed to classrooms.
Thank you.
Thank you. Victoria?
Yeah, hi. Clint, I just want to understand, what does class complexity look like in your province? What do you have, a number of students in class? Do you have a ratio of students in class? What does it look like in your province?
Thank you. Well, as I said, there's a variety of languages. They're almost all based around similar concepts, though. So first off is class size. In many places around the province, we were able to bargain specific size limits on classes. And that's a really fundamental one because it maintains a number of students in front of a teacher that they are able to work with and support properly and build the relationships that are essential to learning. Alongside of that, we have in our contact often something called non-enrolling specialist ratios, and that's people like counselors, learning support teachers, other teachers who provide support often to the more vulnerable students in our system, to the students who have some special educational needs. And they're exactly what they sound like. They're ratios of how many of those, of how many students create one of those roles. And that's around the concept, obviously, of needing an adequate number of those individuals like counselors to support the student population. And then there is also in places the concept of when you have designated students with special educational needs in a classroom, it affects the size and the amount of supports that goes into that classroom. And again, that is around the fundamental idea that the teacher or teachers or support personnel who are in the classroom need a number of students in front of them that they can give the proper amount of time to ensure that the support given to each student enables them to achieve the best they can. So it's a little bit of a variety, but those are the three key concepts around it: is a class size, a ratio of support individuals in the system, and then how you provide extra supports to students who have designated needs.
Thank you. Was negotiating this, was it easy with the government also, or did you have to go through what Saskatchewan is going through now?
Again, most of it was bargained long before I was around doing any of this work. It was bargained locally. And that's a really fundamental part that Samantha's mentioned about the difference between a local trying to do work, a district, pardon me, trying to do work when they don't have funds. So when it was bargained, most of it was local. We have subsequently tried to bargain at the provincial table. I've already mentioned that it was taken out by a government arbitrarily. We fought to get that back, and we've had a couple of rounds where we haven't made a lot of progress, to be honest, but we haven't had the same level of attacks and the same level of avoidance and the same doublespeak, I would call it. We've had a government who sees what it is, which is complex and costly often. And so they have a different idea for solutions often. It's been very difficult, but I think all of us have acknowledged that. And there's a difference between difficult and can't be done. So I would say it was bargained long ago. We haven't had as much success provincially as we would like, but we certainly haven't encountered an environment where it's suggested that that's not possible or not a good way to support student learning.
Great, thanks. Karen, you wanted to say something? I have one more question, but please go ahead.
And I just wanted to add, just to reinforce the importance of it being negotiated provincially. I think it was already mentioned in regards to consistency across the province. It ties into teacher retention. Teachers moving throughout the province want to know wherever they're going to work that they can expect the same type of environment, the same type of supports and resources, and so do parents. So they don't want to rely on, depending on what district that they live in, the type of supports that they're going to have to get there for their children and moving them here and there. So it's very important that the level of government that has the funding, the resources, is the one that you're directly negotiating a contract with. And as was mentioned, a contract that has it can be grieved, it can be tested. There's a level of accountability. There's a level of a reinforcement if the boundaries aren't being adhered to. And that helps the parents and the teacher. So if you're a parent and the class size should be a certain ratio and your child is supposed to be getting certain supports and they're not there, you can go to the school board and say, hey, what's happening? You're not following through on your obligation to me as a parent. And the teacher can do the same thing. We're supposed to have the numbers at this particular level so that I can provide supports for the students so that we can all get the same outcome. They're looking for success. This is how success is going to happen within the system. These boundaries in regards to class size complexities enables us to for that to happen. In Ontario, we have, in regards to primary class size, we do have averages, and junior class size averages are around that. So those are the things that we can work on in regards to also K-1 splits, what those splits look like, what that composition looks like, and that can be reinforced. We get the numbers certain times of the year, and we check in, and our members check in, and parents say, hey, why is this happening? So it really is very important. And once again, you've heard in regards to the resources. We have in Ontario a minimum percentage in regards to special education, number of teachers that are going to be hired to specifically address things around self-regulation, emotional needs. So if your child's within that classroom, the board's supposed to have a minimum number of teachers to meet these needs, right? Which means these students are on a trajectory for success. If their needs are not met, they become part of, a system where it's not what we're aiming for, and we don't want to deal with that. So everyone wants to see these kids successful, and we're saying these are the tools and these are the things that need to be put in place.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. I have one question for you. Are we likely to see longer strikes? When I say longer, I mean maybe a number of days, or instead of the 1 hour, 2 hour breaks? Because I was out, and a lot of parents weren't finding it very easy for them. Are we going to see a more effective result with a longer strike, if you understand what I mean?
Potentially, like I said, all of the options are on the table. We're not ruling anything out in terms of what our plan is going forward. But we would love not to have those things. And we would love to have negotiated an agreement before even having any sanction action taken within Saskatchewan. But in terms of our plan going forward, we do have a plan. It is strategic, but the goal is to get the government back to the table and willing to address the priorities that teachers have put forward, specifically class size and class complexity.
Last week, you said you weren't going to go back to the table until certain conditions have been met. Is there, what are you hearing as regards those conditions now?
I've heard that government has a room available for us to negotiate in, but they haven't brought forward a new mandate. And so we've also heard the Minister of Education say he doesn't want to bring committees into Regina and have coffee and sandwiches if there's no purposeful actions that are coming out of those committees. And that's how I see bargaining. I mean, government has used taxpayer dollars to villainize teachers and make them seem that they are greedy, and to mislead the public about the realities that students and teachers are facing. And again, with negotiations, if they want to book a room and have us sit there and teachers be the ones talking and government saying no, to me, that's not a good use of taxpayer dollars. It's not a good use of anyone's time either. And so we need to have a renewed commitment to be willing to have conversations at the negotiations table where both sides can be satisfied in this process. We aren't putting anything forward saying that this is the be all end all. But we are saying we need to have a conversation. We need to have some sort of commitment around classroom complexity.
Thank you. That's it for me.
Alec?
I got just one more here. Premier Mo was taken off to India for a trade mission. Given that he's been fairly silent throughout the breakdown in negotiations, what are you taking away from the fact that our premier is leaving country amidst all this?
Well, it shows where his priorities are for sure. As I've said before, these are issues that could have been addressed through the 10 days of negotiations at the table that started back in May of last year, the 5 days of conciliation. Government hasn't engaged in meaningful negotiations throughout the entire process. They've provided take it or leave it offers, and really they're ignoring the real problems that students and teachers are facing in classrooms right across Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan. But I'm not surprised, honestly. It's right in line with all of the other actions that we have seen from this government. Public education has not been a priority. Children and their needs have not been a priority of this government. And teachers and the public are standing up and saying it's time to listen. It's time to invest and make a real investment in kids and in public education. And it's time for government to listen. We have submitted or from our records of what we're able to see through Tell Them Tuesday, there's been over 52,000 emails sent to government in the last month. If they're not listening to that, they are not just ignoring teachers, they're not just ignoring children, they are ignoring Saskatchewan and the needs of Saskatchewan. And so, like I said, I'm not surprised he's taking off to India, but it is definitely disappointing.
Yeah, thanks. That's all for me.
Okay, so not seeing any other hands up or any other questions in the chat. I just want to thank everyone for joining us here today, and a huge thank you to Karen, Clint, and Connie for joining us here and shedding a light on possibilities of what is possible through the negotiations round, recognizing that it's not all perfect, but recognizing that it's a step forward. And the only avenue that I see as not being ideal is ignoring this problem. And that is what our government is trying to do. And we are saying that we can't take it anymore. Teachers can no longer fill the gaps the government has created over the last decade. We need more supports, not just for teachers to be successful, but our children and our students to be successful in our classes. So thank you to everyone for coming and joining us here this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.